What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I don't think anyone will be surprised that there is a bunch of Loki on this tier list, and I'm going to start out with the Loki Wiccan deck, which is a very powerful, very commonly played, very strong attempt at mimicking what Arishem does with less of the major downside. This deck is able to play an extremely powerful game plan with Loki into Wiccan, and then generally just cheat from there. Loki makes everything cheaper, Wiccan gives you more energy, and you aren't really giving up a ton to get this. You are still running the basically best mid-range points package in the game. Your only real concession to being a Wiccan deck is that you run Maria Hill some of the time. Like, this is not a deck that is sacrificing a lot to get what it wants out of this situation. This is effectively an evolution of like the Thena sort of move decks, where instead of being a Thena move deck with like Gwenpool and whatever, they're like, why would I do that when instead I can simply just cheat? I can play Loki, I can play Wiccan, I do either one of those things, I do something stupid, and they're playing a fair game against me, and they just look dumb for trying to be fair. This is a deck that is attempting to leverage unfair cards into even more unfair advantages, a very straightforward and powerful deck that fundamentally is not sacrificing as much as it should be for the rewards that it gets, because Wiccan is a 4/7, and most importantly, Loki is a 3/5 for some reason. Speaking of cheating energy and playing Loki, Arishem is still the metagame defining threat that you remember it being. This is cheating energy in a much more reliable way. It is always going to be cheating energy, but it is of course playing Loki in a less reliable way because you aren't really going to always have it in your hand. Loki turn 2 snaps out of Arishem are the strongest snaps in the game, bar some of the combo decks that you can sometimes see, and they are and always should be extremely respected. Cassandra Nova is at this point perhaps the most played card at High Infinite, and Arishem is still a perfectly fine to great choice, even in the face of about 40% of decks playing a card that comes as close as any card in the game to hard countering it. A lot of this is because of the double duty that Loki pulls. Loki is your great offensive option, but also minimizes your vulnerabilities to Cassandra Nova. I realize I'm going to be saying this a lot, but Loki is a card that definitely needs to be looked at, and frankly, if it is not dealt with at some point, I think people are going to get a little bit upset. The card is cool and fun, and I'm happier with this current build of Loki than I have been with the other ways that this card has existed. I think this version of the card is less upsetting, but I also think that specifically Arishem playing it on turn 2 is a ridiculous thing to happen, and the fact is that it's dominating the metagame right now. Everyone knows how I feel about Loki, everyone knows I'm a Loki sympathizer. I would expect and hope for a nerf to this card. Next up is a deck in a similar vein. Responding to an increase in Clog as a way to combat Loki, Yo Woody ended up cooking up this list, which I do enjoy because it has actual counterplay to Clog. One of the major things you'll notice about Loki and Arishem is they both like using the space they have on the board. And since you aren't going to be reasonably able to compete with them on the axis of doing things that are fair, they are always going to cheat more energy than you. You try to compete with them on the axis of filling up their board space, so it doesn't matter how much energy they have, or how many cards are in their hand, or what those cards cost, they aren't going to be able to play them. Clog, then, has become a major player in this metagame, and this list tries to maintain the power of the Loki list by also including a Clog subtheme in addition to Lady Deathstrike. So the idea here is to metagame against the things that are cheating. Marvel Snap is cool in this way. When there is something that cheats harder than you, you can try to interact with it on an axis it is unable to engage with. Those Loki decks are going to cheat harder than you in terms of energy, in terms of having a bunch of it, or in terms of discounts, but you can cheat back by giving them no spaces to play. I like this deck because it balances having that offensive Clog game plan with the Lady Deathstrike on defense, and also maintains a lot of the powerful mid-range cards that these archetypes are known for. When we talk about Clog, there are several options that you have at your disposal. The most classic Clog list in the current metagame is still the Dagger and Ajax pairing, but one thing that you'll notice is that very many decks in this metagame have Clog sub-themes so that they are able to compete on at least one axis against the massive energy cheaters. So, when you have a deck like this, yes, you are doing Clog things, right? You have the ability to use the Acid Arrow, you have White Widow, you have Beast to bounce the White Widow, you have a bunch of different things that are able to clog your opponent, you have a Green Goblin, you have a lot of ability to set up situations where a location is fully closed off and then win another location with an Ajax or a Dagger. That is how this deck works. It is best understood as like a sort of combo deck adjusted to the metagame, and what that means is that you want to be a deck that is restricting your opponent's energy output by restricting their space with which to do it, and then playing something that is so much more efficient that you overcome the fact that they have an energy advantage over you via Loki or Wiccan or Arishem. You do this with Clog and with giant dudes. Dagger and Ajax are the giantest dudes you can get at a fairly minimal cost. That is how this deck functions right now. This list has a very similar ethos. I actually recently did a video on it. I personally believe that if you really hate Loki decks, if you really hate Arishem, if you are someone who has watched this episode of the top decks and gone, man, I hate all of this crap, you should do something like this. And it doesn't have to be exactly this, but this is a very coherent game plan against what those decks bring to bear because it recognizes that it cannot compete with them in a fair world. They cheat harder. They do bigger stuff. So what do you do to level the playing field? You interact with them on the axis they are not prepared for. You clog them, and then Cannonball is infinitely large. That is how this deck works. You are trying to combat decks that are cheating way harder than anyone would reasonably be able to beat normally. They are level 1 of the metagame. This is level 2. How do you beat those decks? You interact with them on an axis that isn't energy, because they are going to be better than you at energy. Speaking of interacting on axes that are not energy, Sandman is relatively able to do that still, but it does have some awkward matchups. Right now, it's just very hard to beat the card Loki when you play a Sandman deck because they're just going to be able to do the things you do, and as a Sandman deck, you need to be ahead if you want to reasonably be able to Sandman people out of the game. It's not the kind of deck that can sit there and be behind, and the Loki Wiccan decks, or really any Loki deck, they're so good at getting tempo that all they really need is like one of your 6-drops, and you just end up being kind of mollywopped. You don't end up in a good spot. I'm not saying this deck is bad, but it does have some markedly ungood matchups. And, you know, ungood is another word for bad. This is a deck that is a good gatekeeper, though. There are a bunch of decks that people would be playing that are able to beat or be beaten by Sandman. Now, this deck does sort of define the outskirts of the metagame. If Arishem and Loki are defining what the inner metagame is about, this is a deck that exists on the outside of it and polices the decks that might be able to beat Arishem and Loki. That's the role that I've noticed it taking. One thing you'll notice is that we're not a Patriot list right now. I am doing my best whenever I play this deck to not let people know that I am a Sandman deck. Now, this has two functions. The first one is that obviously if they don't know that you're a Sandman deck, you can like really sneak it by them, and no one really expects Sandman Hawkeye stuff. That's a lot of why I like this package instead of, like, say, playing a Claw there or whatever, which is also perfectly acceptable. Now, the second reason that this happens is because a lot of the time the version of the deck that is a Patriot Blue Marvel deck gets completely obliterated by Eliath. And I hate putting people in a situation where they are doing something that telegraphed and that vulnerable to an extremely common and powerful card. I think Silver Surfer has become underrated. As much as I talk about how it's hard to match these Loki, Wiccan, cheat energy type decks without having some kind of way to like actually clog them up and interact with them on a different axis, Surfer is just straight up reasonable. It's not exactly favored into those decks when they're doing their thing, but it does have a very powerful nut draw. It has great Arishem potential because you can play multiple Cassandra Novas. You are going to be in a situation where this deck is likely unfavored if they're doing their nut draw, but also if they're not doing their nut draw, you suddenly go into like an actual potential favored matchup because you are able to compete with the Thena package stuff on points very easily. It's a little bit harder for you to compete with, I'm getting 2 extra energy and I'm playing a Red Hulk and I'm doing all this Alioth stuff. That's hard for you to beat, definitely. One other thing to keep in mind, though, is you are a Killmonger deck. Very many of these decks are Ultron decks, whether they be from Sandman or from Wiccki. However you want to look at it, there are going to be some opportunities to maybe Killmonger some Ultrons. That is something you should be on the lookout for. I know that there is at least one high-ranked player, Yo Woody, who is playing with Red Guardian over Copycat. I totally understand why that would make sense. I'm just not in the business of cutting Copycat. There are always plenty of replacements you can make in a Surfer deck. I think that those slots where you have like Nocturne and Copycat are like fairly flexible right now, although these are the ones that I would choose. With so many decks having a Clog subtheme, one deck that is very good at taking advantage of that is pretty much anything that has Annihilus in it. Because there are so many Widow's Bites and Acid Arrows and Hood Vipers running around in this metagame, being an Annihilus deck sort of gives you a trump card over all of that crap. We talked about how Clog is proliferating as a result of these sort of Loki decks, these Wiccan decks that are just cheating energy too hard. The only way you can really interact with them is Clog. This is a deck that is looking to sort of counter the counter. All of these decks that are trying to like terrorize the Loki Wiccan players, the Arishem players with their Clog, well, they're very, very weak to a deck like this. The card Annihilus is so phenomenally powerful into like the Werewolf Bounce decks, for example, where so much of the early game of those decks is just clogging your opponent. And if you're not able to do that, you're not really doing anything, and getting it all undone by just Annihilus is incredibly strong. This is also a deck that has reasonable ability to clog in its own right, thanks to the card Annihilus. So it is also able to combat Arishem on those axes. It's a little bit worse at dealing with Wiccan stuff because, they run like at least Kitty Pride, and if not, sometimes maybe have other cards that are able to prevent them from being clogged. But it is still functional at both of those roles. This list was popularized by ELA alongside Jimmy Dickens, and it is another deck that is looking to leverage the same type of dynamic, except, and this is interesting, it's actually looking to be more of a forceful Clog deck alongside some unexpected power output. Now, you might think there are a bunch of important cards in this deck. The important card in this deck is actually Hazmat. Hazmat is doing double duty here. It is minimizing the power of your rocks and your Mysterios that Annihilus can then send over. It is also making sure that your Abomination is free. And yes, we are playing High Evolutionary just for Abomination. And sometimes it is your back-end Ajax game plan. But most of the time when you play this, you are not holding Hazmat for turn 6. You are attempting to do something ridiculous with either Abomination or Annihilus and just send over a bunch of stuff. You have these draws where it's like Mysterio into Debris, into Hazmat, into Annihilus, and you are clogging 2 spots on every single lane right there. Yes, one of those spots is the real Mysterio. No, you don't care when you are clogging 6 of the 12 spots on the board. And that is what this deck is really attempting to leverage. There's these mass clog Annihilus game plans that Hazmat allows. And then also, while you're doing that, you have free Mockingbird. You have cheap, you have cheap Abomination. There's too many A names in Snap. You have basically free Abomination a lot of the time. You have big Ajax. There are 3 A names in this freaking deck, dude. Ridiculous. And so you have a lot of different options against a lot of different things in the metagame. This list was better for me when people didn't know what it was. I was playing it a couple days ago before it really picked up. Now I think it's picked up, people are aware of what it was, and they're actually playing around the very dumb things you can do, final turn 16 power Ajax, and Very, very large abomination is like kind of the mid-roll for this deck. The high rolls are like these full clog games that your opponents can't do anything about. There's a lot of powerful stuff that this deck is able to bring to bear right now. This might be the most purely metagamed deck of all time. Two of the top 5 players in the world have recommended it to me though, so it is worth talking about in that context. This is just an extremely metagame deck. It's just all the relevant tech cards and then as much power as we can pack in there as possible. We want to be able to be a deck that is playing Mobius. We want to also maintain the fact that we have something of a Clog game plan of our own, because otherwise we end up in a spot where we kind of get run over by the Wiccan decks if we're not able to interact with them on that axis. Everything kind of has to be at this point because of how powerful it is when you are playing against Loki Wiccan stuff. And so you end up in this spot where what's actually happening with this deck is you're using your Sasquatch and your Mockingbird to supplement your tech cards, your Clog game plan, etc. Now, there is a risk here. When you don't have Mobius and they Loki you and they get your loot cage, you're gonna die. Like, there's a lot of playing the cards that are counters to your deck in this that make it a little bit of an awkward decision, I think, but it is absolutely a fine choice in the context of everything we've discussed so far. I think you can understand why a deck built like this makes sense, because it is just trying to address everything we've talked about at the same time. I feel as though Loki Bounce has fallen behind the other iterations of this kind of thing, where I would rather be playing Loki Wiccan pretty much all of the time as opposed to Loki Bounce, but it is not that much worse, and it is still a distinct archetype. The issues this deck has are more limited to, like, what are the upsides for doing it? Why would I want to be doing this instead of Loki Wiccan? What am I getting out of it? And the answer is basically Werewolf by Night. And if you are better at leveraging Werewolf by Night, if you are able to make that card be as impactful as it can be, then you are going to be in a very good spot when you address this metagame. If you are not able to leverage that, if you're playing a bunch of games, you're not drawing Werewolf, just go play the other deck. I think it's a little bit more consistent at doing what it does, with less, I would say, room for skill expression, and probably also less of a ceiling, but it is just so much more consistently able to do unfair stuff. This list also has some issues with Clog. It has counterplay to those issues, but that doesn't mean those issues don't exist. Because this deck wants to be moving Wolf around, one of the things that I've noticed that I can do is be like, oh, okay, that's where they want the Wolf to land on the final turn. Let me Viper something over there. Now the Wolf can't land there. Bye-bye. And so, like, there's a lot of that kind of stuff with this deck, where it's skill testing to play against and with, but ultimately, I think it probably falls short when you could be playing Loki Wiccan. Zoo is the same deck it has always been. Same list, same ethos, same theory, same power level. This 12 cards is just good. It is just good to be playing this deck. Is it the best deck in the game? No. Is it perfectly acceptable and plausible to play Zoo? Yes. This is a totally good deck. There is absolutely nothing wrong with being a Zoo gamer. You are going to be able to output points in meaningful ways. You are going to be able to play pure Marvel Snap, where it is just about the points on the board, and that is the only thing that matters to you. Unless they have Killmonger, and then you have Kyera. It's a totally acceptable, perfectly reasonable deck. Nobody should be shaming anyone for playing Zoo. It is perfectly fine, perfectly good, and perfectly reasonable. The issues it runs into are that it only has points. So when you run into a deck that requires some kind of interaction, you end up in an awkward spot. You can also sometimes struggle with Clog, although it's not necessarily the most common thing. I have seen people running things like a Nightcrawler in their decks in order to avoid having to struggle with Clog, because Nightcrawler is very, very good in that situation. You are able to, with Marvel Boy, win those lanes that are clogged up anyway. Because you are such a good deck at putting power into closed off locations, whether that be from Marvel Boy or Khazar or Blue Marvel, the Clog stuff is never as good as it feels like it is against you because of those options. You also, of course, have things like Mockingbird that scale off of your opponent giving you cards, and Gilgamesh is just sort of oppressively large. He is still going to be a very big guy when you play him. This list is fairly mediocre, but it does one thing really well in my experience. It beats Arishem. This list is legitimately very strong into Arishem for reasons that I think make some sense, right? Like, unless they're Lokiing or playing something that puts cards in their hand like Agent Coulson, discarding Arishem's cards is actually very impactful. Hitting meaningful stuff on that is very good. And of course, you are a Darkhawk Cassandra Nova deck. It's very hard for you to be bad in Arishem just on base, but you're also attacking them. Again, we talked about this on an axis that isn't energy or anything like that. You are attacking their hand, and then you are saying, I am going to play Darkhawk, I'm going to play Cassandra Nova, I'm going to be bigger than you, your Shang-Chi is getting discarded by my Moon Knight, your Blob is getting discarded by my Moon Knight, I am getting a Proxima Midnight, I'm getting a free 7 power, and then I am going to keep discarding your stuff, right? Like, that is how this deck wants to operate, and it is a deck that, in my experience, actually does have a meaningfully good Arishem matchup. The issue that this deck runs into is against basically everything else, it has to hit the discards on really important cards, or it ends up just having no points and no tech. And that is a consequence of being a Moon Knight deck. When you want to play tech cards, you have Shadow King, you have Shang-Chi, you have Enchantress. They are even cost, and it's very hard to fit them in the deck. One thing that I've been trying in this deck is Kate Bishop, because, yes, she is even cost, but also she puts odd cost stuff into your hand. And one of the things that I've struggled with this list were those games where it's like I'm playing a 1-drop and then I'm playing another 1-drop on turn 2 and then I start playing the game, and I hate that. So I'm trying the Kate Bishop. I'm not, married to it. I think you could very easily do pretty much anything else, like Hydra Bob or whatever, or Nico Minoru. I'm not married to it. But it is just something that I've been trying out because I feel like there is potential in this deck, but maybe the potential is capped by the fact that it is a fairly medium points deck with no tech at all. And so in matchups that are not Arishem, it's really gotta hit those discards. Destroy is what I would describe as exactly the replacement level deck, where I hope you have better options than Destroy, but it is possible that you don't, and it is still very playable. I just think that it's very likely that people will have better options than this deck. Destroy's issue, and it actually is a little bit better than it was last week because of the Clog sort of revolution that's been happening, but the issue that it has is that it kind of needs to get what it needs to get very early in the game, and without that stuff, it ends up in a very awkward spot. That issue is compounded by the fact that it's vulnerable to basically every tech card. So even when you nut off, even when you have everything that's amazing, you suddenly can still end up in spots where you're losing to Shang-Chi and Shadow King, you're losing to Rogue or Enchantress, you're losing to Sandman, you lose to a bunch of stuff for no reason, basically. And so the deck demands that you play aggressively when you have your good hands, but you can end up having that decision reversed on you late in games because of the way this deck has vulnerabilities. It is a fine choice, but I do hope that there are better options in your arsenal for the current metagame. Now, all of that said, this is perfectly fine into Clog decks. There's a lot of decks that are running Clog sub-themes right now, and Destroy really does benefit from that in a meaningful way, whether that be discounting death or getting extra points on your Carnages or Venoms or whatever. You end up in a good spot against that kind of stuff for sure. Mr. Negative is a perfectly playable and good deck right now. I think that this deck is a very reasonable choice that you can choose to play. It has some vulnerabilities, but not as many as people like to think. It has very straightforward snap and retreat lines. You snap when you do an early Mr. Negative, and then you retreat when it's not going to win. I think the one intricacy of this deck that might trip people up is that it actually seems to be, in my experience, a little more of a Sage Taskmaster deck than it is a traditional Mr. Negative deck. One of the things people are very used to playing around in Mr. Negative decks is oh, big Iron Man, whatever. they're not very used to like Wong, Sage, Taskmaster. There's a lot of like Wong, Mystique, and then I have one flipped card, and then I go Sage, Taskmaster, one of them is flipped, and then suddenly you have like 40 power dudes. You have a lot of options for how you approach this stuff. Vulnerabilities do include, like, if you're going to be like a Wong Mystique deck, you really need to make sure you don't get like White Widow Acid Arrow on that lane. That is really, really, really bad when it happens to you. So there are like definitely situations where like you have these nut draws and then you get clogged up and then you're just very sad, and that is real. But against like most normal quote unquote decks, you are going to be able to just outpower them. The only interaction they're going to have for you, both the Wiccan and the Arishem decks, is unfortunately going to be a Goliath. That is going to be a card that is meaningful to you. Namora is, I would say, below par right now, but it's still a deck that has some appeal in that it is very, very reasonably able to do a lot of points in a world where your opponent isn't interacting with you. And that's kind of the thing, right? We've talked about these Loki Wiccan decks, these Loki Arishem decks. One thing they have in common is they are running at least just Goliath, sometimes Goliath and Magneto, all right? We've talked about how to counteract those decks. They're running Clog, right? This is a deck that is vulnerable to both of those things. It is vulnerable to getting heinously Goliath. It is vulnerable to getting Magnetoed. It is vulnerable to getting clogged on the Wong lane. A lot of things can go wrong for you. The interaction that is popular at the moment in Marvel Snap is those things we discussed. Clog and Goliath. That's what defines this metagame right now. That's not a good spot for this deck to exist in. Bebop hit rank 2 in the world with Deezcard. I am still not the biggest Deezcard believer. He was up there already. Like, it's hard to gauge exactly how much of the climb was done with Deezcard, but it is a reasonable and powerful deck. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that of the decks in this section, Mr. Negative and Deezcard are the ones that are the most interesting to me. Deezcard has this thing going for it where it is just flat out powerful, but it is a deck that has some, like, oh, I got Sandman, oh, I didn't play around it. It kind of, to me, requires a fair amount of metagame knowledge. As weird as this sounds, it requires a lot of knowledge of what your opponents are thinking to win with this deck, because it is such a simple deck in terms of form and function. You are basically only doing points, and you need to be allocating them in smart ways such that your opponent is unable to end up beating you. That is a meaningfully difficult thing to do. I think this deck is deceptively simple, meaning that people think it is simple, but it actually is kind of difficult to play because of the recognition you need to have of various matchups and various play patterns. Because if you are not very on point, this deck is a almost pure test of your Marvel Snap skill, your basics, and if you are not on point with your basics, you will not have a good time with this deck. Phoenix Force is one of the better options if you want to play a combo deck right now. There are a lot of decks that cannot meaningfully interact with this, and having this kind of power that you are able to bring to bear, the ability to snap into whatever. It has a similar snap profile to Mr. Negative, but it's a little bit harder to set that up. Being able to be a Nimrod deck as well is extremely powerful right now. Again, there's a lot of Clog, a lot of weird stuff. You get to ignore almost all of that with Phoenix Force and just focus on, I would like to maximize my output. Maybe then I'll Shuri Nimrod. Maybe then I will blow up everything and get a million dudes everywhere. There's still stuff to play around, but this is a deck that I think in terms of combo decks is more well-positioned than many of the others. It does not have the same vulnerabilities to the major counterplay cards in the metagame that something like Wong does, for example. Last up is Move Bounce, and you can play this deck and it will test you. I think this is one of the hardest decks in the entire game of Marvel Snap to play. At least in terms of sequencing and figuring out what your final turns are, this deck is dangerous and difficult. It is hard to make it work. A lot of things are going to be expected of you. Your ordering will be tested. Your hand size management will be tested. Your ability to not just play Heimdall every single turn 6 will be tested. But you can be rewarded with very surprising and powerful point output. This deck has a lot of points in it and is only going to get better next month with Madam Web and Aranya. It is possible that this deck might just be worth putting the time into now so you get a sense for how it works. It is a playable, functional deck. You can win with this, but there are so many pitfalls you could fall into along the way. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for sticking with me through that extended Marvel yappage. I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.